Okay, Section 4 really kicks off our detailed, operationally oriented discussion around domestic transportation, domestic on-forwarding, beginning with drayage operations. As we will recall from our module on ocean freight, drayage is a trucking term that is associated with the short-haul movement of ocean containers to and from a port complex, as we see in our image on the right. These are truckers coming in to hopefully drop off an empty and pick up a full container, or drop off a full container for export and pick up a full container on the import side. Second bullet, the term drayage is also used in a rail environment when ocean containers or truck trailers are transported to and from a railhead operation. We see this quite frequently when ocean operations connect with rail operations and move containers inland directly from a ship as part of an inland point intermodal shipment that we spoke of many times previously, or where dray operators will pick up 53-foot trailers from a transload operation and take to a railhead. We'll be talking lots about that too. As a note, this module studies both port and rail drayage. While there's no official limit, port drayage operations usually take place within a 5 to 100 mile range of a port. Rail drayage, on the other hand, can be longer than 100 miles, but hopefully not too much longer, because if it gets any longer, you might as well just truck it to its destination anyway. A quick trade tip, and we saw this already too, the verb to dray is used to depict the act of moving containers or trailers short distances, ocean freight and rail specific distances. These drayage companies, they're legal entities that provide trucking services to or from port terminals and or rail heads. That's a general definition. More specifically, as we note in our second bullet point, a drayage operation can consist of an owner-operator, which we defined previously, that owns a single power unit, a tractor, and contracts out his or her services. On the other hand, drayage companies can also be large operations with millions of dollars in equipment and assets. Within the ecosystem, drayage operators range from literally one person, one man, one woman with their tractor doing their thing, draying in and out of ports to and from railheads, to major corporations that own substantial assets and employ drivers directly. As importers, we want to be sure that we know who we're working for. As always, we at Mercado are not here to advocate for owner-operators versus large companies. We will say that you have to know who you're dealing with as an importer. As a part of the drayage world, drayage companies can be classified as asset-based, non-asset-based, or asset-light. And once again, it's important as an importer to know what classification your service provider falls under. As the name indicates in our second bullet point, an asset-based drayage company owns or leases the power units, the truck tractors that transport containers. The assets are the trucks themselves. Third bullet, non-asset-based drayage operators contract out for services through owner-operators. This model is very common, actually, in port infrastructures around the country. And as we see in our last bullet, asset-light companies have a combination of owned tractors as well as contracted drayage services. This is the most typical model, because even the most asset-heavy drayage service provider isn't going to have equipment and or drivers in the right place at the right time 100% of the time. They will supplement their own equipment with contracted drayage services, typically through owner-operators. That's very common. We'll say it one more time. We're not here to advocate for one type of carrier over another, one type of drayage company over another. It's just important that you as an importer know who you're dealing with and what their capabilities are. Certainly in the post-9/11 world, in order for draymen of any size to provide drayage services, certain safety, environmental, and security requirements must be met. Once again, as an importer, or even as a freight forwarder or customs broker that works with drayage companies, we have to make sure that our draymen have these certifications. Second bullet, and this is really quite important, all U.S. ports have strict regulatory requirements related to drayage companies and their drivers being able to access port terminals. Definitely in a post 9/11 world. Definitely as part of trying to secure our maritime supply chain and make it safe from any type of nefarious activities. A trade tip to wrap up this slide: more and more U.S. ports are requiring drayage companies to have appointments to pick up or drop off containers to or from a port terminal. This is a big deal, especially when we're working with really large ports like New York, New Jersey, certainly LA Long Beach. This whole appointment thing, if not managed properly, can extend our cumulative lead time, which is a theme we've been harping on from the very beginning. More on that in upcoming slides. For now, just be aware that many ports and the individual terminals on those ports operate appointment systems. You can't just show up to drop off an empty. You can't just show up to pick up a full. The drayman has to have an appointment. Let's roll out a supply chain perspective entitled Drayage and Port Operations. Without question, port drayage is one of the most important activities that takes place within an inbound supply chain. Ironically, while drayage may seem like an easily identifiable service and a cut and dry process, there is nothing that could be further from the truth. Due to added complexities related to things like U.S. port congestion and changes in chassis management, port drayage can be a difficult and expensive exercise to carry out. Do not be lulled to sleep by the short distance nature of port drayage operations. Containers being moved from a terminal 10 miles to a transload facility. Containers coming off of a terminal going 50 miles out to a distribution center. How hard can that be? Do not be lulled to sleep by that short distance. It's really quite complicated. Second paragraph. One upstream source of complexity is the need to coordinate port drayage with other supply chain players like the steamship line, terminal operator, customs broker, and drayage company. That whole theme of integrating all of these players now within the framework of drayage operations. Basically, second sentence, second paragraph, without vital information from each of the parties, related mainly to things like when does the ship show up, are goods customs cleared, and is a container available, the drayage process will be suboptimized. We as importers, we as customs brokers, need to be working with these other parties so we can coordinate the timely pickup of containers on a terminal. Third paragraph. An example of this above complexity is the fact that many ports in the U.S. require an appointment for the drop-off of empties and pickup of full boxes. These days, LA Long Beach being a perfect example, of the 13 container terminals, the majority of them are now requiring an appointment not only to pick up a full, but drop off an empty. That's a big deal. We need to be aware of that. Second sentence, third paragraph. In many cases, even though a drayman has an appointment, he or she must wait in line to get into the terminal and meet the appointment. Of course, this results in additional drayage charges like wait time, attempts, etc. Trucks sitting idly, waiting to get onto a terminal, translate into lost time and lost money. Of course, additional charges. We as importers, as we're negotiating drayage, and we should be directly involved in that negotiation, even if we coordinate it through a freight forwarder or a customs broker, we need to know all of the charges associated with this. We'll see what those charges are in upcoming sections. Last paragraph. Given these complexities, U.S. importers cannot ignore the drayage process and must pay particular attention to operations in every port they import into. Do not get lulled to sleep, as we said previously, by the short distance nature of drayage operations. That short distance can be very misleading. Pay attention to it. As it relates to drayage operations, change of title in this slide, let's talk a little bit about chassis requirements. And we can see some examples of chassis going into a terminal on the right-hand side. Clearly, in order for ocean containers to be drayed, you have to have a chassis. And that chassis, to remind ourselves, it's the wheeled metal frame, again, we see it on the right, upon which ocean containers are loaded and or offloaded. Third bullet, chassis can accommodate different container sizes. They're called slider chassis. We saw all of this when we went through the ocean module. We're just bringing it back up. Final bullet here, chassis are required for both port and rail drayage moves. The containers and trailers are lifted on and off the chassis. We can't do much without chassis. As we'll see in an upcoming supply chain perspective, the world of chassis management has changed dramatically in the United States in the last 10 years. Let's start that discussion by saying that drayage companies don't always use their own chassis. In fact, oftentimes they don't. There are many drayage operators, certainly owner-operators, that don't own any chassis. They only own the actual tractor, the power unit itself. As such, as we note in our sub-bullet, chassis owners and or leasing companies are oftentimes different from the drayage firms. That means we have another player in the mix that has to be coordinated with for the pickup and drop-off of full and empty containers off of a port terminal. Another super important point, the charges for chassis usage are usually, if not always, separate from drayage fees. The actual transportation on and off a terminal is different than the chassis usage. One might pay, depends on the port, but one might pay $300 plus fuel for a dray, say 10 miles off of a terminal. The chassis charge is different. Typically, use LA Long Beach as an example, $35 a day with no free time on the chassis. To reiterate this point, we'll present it as a trade tip. The charges for chassis usage, the usage and or detention fees are completely separate from any container-related charges, detention of the container itself being one example. We will talk more about chassis charges. Once again, let's just set the story straight and say that drayage services and chassis usage, management, and charges totally separate from the container and its drayage. Let's drive this point home, as we said we would, with another supply chain perspective, this time entitled Chassis for Ocean Drayage. Prior to the 2010-2012 timeframe, chassis usage in the U.S. was managed by the ocean carriers, and the cost was included in the overall ocean freight charge. Those were the good old days. This structure was unique to the U.S. market because in all other major markets, Europe, Asia, etc., chassis were not managed by the steamship lines. It was a separate deal that had to be managed by other players in the maritime supply chain. Last sentence, first paragraph. This U.S.-specific practice ended around the 2012 timeframe when the steamship lines divested themselves of chassis cost, usage, and maintenance. The carriers, the ocean carriers, wanted out of the hassle of dealing with chassis. Second paragraph. Since that time, each port and its many players has had to go it alone when it comes to chassis and essentially finding ways to meet the needs of importers and exporters without disrupting global supply chains. At first, a combination of drayage companies, terminal operators, 3PLs, and other players, they started acquiring and managing the chassis process. This port-specific process has not been without its challenges, however, in areas like chassis being available to use in the first place, driver coordination, having men and women available to drive and in the right physical location, the positioning of chassis where they are in terms of where they need to be, terminal-specific policies around appointments as one examples, and the chassis usage rates. Things have gotten a lot better with chassis management, but that puzzle has yet to be solved. Once again, we said this previously, let's not let ourselves get lulled to sleep or ignore drayage/chassis management operations in favor of things like ocean transportation. Ocean's super important, but drayage can sneak up on us rather quickly. Last paragraph. Importers need to understand the specific chassis policies that are in place for every port of discharge they work with, and they can differ. This is especially so in the area of cost. How much is daily usage? We mentioned $35 a day in LA Long Beach. That doesn't mean it's $35 a day in the port of Philadelphia, for example. What's the per diem? Any detention charges associated with chassis, etc. But also around the existence of chassis pools, and in the larger ports, what's called a pool of pools. We'll talk more about chassis pools in upcoming slides and sections, but these are scenarios where chassis operators have come together to create interchange agreements for their chassis, where companies essentially donate. They still own the chassis, but they're donating a number of chassis to a pool, as we talked about in the ocean module, and participants in the pool can use other participants' chassis too. In the big ports, these pool of pools are just that, where individual chassis pools come together and create these mega pools. That exists in the port of LA Long Beach. Wrapping up this supply chain perspective, last sentence, last paragraph. Without all of this detailed knowledge, importers are bound to experience time delays related to drayage and cost that they did not anticipate or budget for. Enough said on the subject of drayage, its costs, and how chassis management is separate from the drayage service. All right, that's it for this section. We will continue on when we come back with drayage operations for import containers. See you then.